Good morning, everybody, and welcome to November's payroll update. Since our last webinar, we've had the budget, and we're now in a position where we know nearly everything that we need to start the next tax year. There are a couple of rates that we're still waiting for, but we're in a really good position this year. So this session today is going to let you know what to expect for the new tax year, the 22-23 tax year. From an agenda point of view, we're going to look at two new NIC categories from April 22. And then we will look at the rates and thresholds. Like I've said, we've nearly got everything that we need, just waiting for a couple. So I will show you those, and then you'll have them for reference for later. A look ahead to what else might be coming along, and then we will cover questions. So we will have questions at the end of the session. If you want to ask questions as we go through, please feel free to do so. Just interrupt me verbally. Otherwise, put your questions in the chat box and we'll cover all the questions at the end. Your choice. So let's make a start. New NIC categories from April 2022. So the first new category that we will have for next April is National Insurance Category V, and that's available for employers of qualifying veterans. So an employer who employs a veteran in their first civilian job after leaving the armed forces, they can claim NIC relief. You will be aware of this already, I'm sure, because I've mentioned it in previous updates, because that NIC relief is actually in place at the moment, because the idea came through this time last year, but that didn't give HMRC, all the payroll software companies, enough time to get the framework in place to have it in the payroll software ready to start this April. So whilst in theory at the moment employers are eligible to pay zero rate national insurance contributions on qualifying veterans, in practice they are still paying the national insurance and they will be able to recover it at the end of the tax year. So what we've got now is an update on what we already knew. So let's go through the things that that new knowledge that we've been given. So first of all, how do you reclaim any NIC that you've paid this year that you're entitled to claim back because you've been employing a veteran? Again, the actual guidance is still quite sketchy, but you claim it back through RTI. So one assumes that when you get the start of the new tax year, you've got your new payroll software version up and running, you will be able to reclaim that NIC back through an EPS, I would expect. If your software doesn't have functionality to be able to do that, then HMRC have said that you will be able to claim it back using HMRC's basic pay-as-you-earn tools, or BPT. Alternatively, if that one's not going to work for you either, then you can get in touch with HMRC and claim the NI relief back that way. From April 2022, there will be a specific national insurance category V for veterans, and so then the NIC relief will be applied upon use of that NI category V. So how do you know whether somebody is a qualifying veteran? So if you employ somebody who has left the forces and this is their first civilian employment since leaving the forces, then they are a qualifying veteran. As long as they have served a minimum of 1 day in the forces, and that can even be just basic training, then they would be a qualifying veteran. Now, for some, that might be relatively straightforward because they might have left the forces and are applying for civilian posts more or less straight away. We know that there are other veterans who maybe have sustained injuries, whether they are physical or psychological, and it's been some time, maybe even years, since they left the armed forces. The gap between when they left the forces and when they take up their first civilian post is irrelevant. As long as this is their first job since leaving the forces, then it's a qualifying employment. The relief lasts for 12 months. So the period, that 12-month period, starts on the first day of the employment, and from April 22 onwards, you would just put them onto National Insurance Category V, and there is 0 rate employer national insurance up to the upper secondary threshold, and the veterans have now got their own specific one called a VUST, a Veterans Upper Secondary Threshold, which happily mirrors the usual upper secondary threshold and the apprentices upper secondary threshold. So all those three are all at that same amount. If the employee does not stay with that employer for the full 12 months and they leave that job and take up post with another employer, that 12-month qualifying period, its start date does not change. It is fixed. But that 12-month qualifying period then does last for 12 months. So if they go and start work for another employer, the second employer can use however many weeks or months of that qualifying period are still remaining, and they can then claim the remainder of the 0 rate relief for the rest of the year. So say an employee took up post on the 6th of May and then left that job in July and started a new one with a new employer in August, that second employer would be able to continue claiming that 0 rate relief right through until the 5th of May, which is that last day of that 12 months. There is a bit of an issue of how, as an employer, will you know whether this veteran is an eligible veteran? Hopefully you would know, because hopefully HR would have let you know, because presumably HR will have done an interview, and they will have looked at the past employment history, and they'll be able to see that there's a veteran there and that this is the first civilian post. And if HR let you know, marvellous. But the onus is on an employer to establish whether they are employing a veteran. We did get in touch with HMRC to say, is there going to be some way of notifying employers that they're employing a veteran in the first 12 months? And the answer is no. So it's either got to come from your own recruitment processes or from the veteran themselves. So the veteran can provide evidence to the new employer, so it might be previous P45s or a veteran ID card, to prove their employment history and the qualifying status. What HMRC is trying to do is to educate employers and veterans about this need to explore this and find out whether or not somebody is a veteran in the first 12 months of civilian employment. So HMRC are putting articles in their employer bulletin, the agent update, any updates to basic pay-as-you-earn tools. And they're also working with the Office for Veteran Affairs to increase awareness amongst the veteran community of that measure and encourage them to tell any new employers. but there is not scope for any update to RTI, because I'd said, well, if someone moves from one employment to the next, can there be something built into RTI that says, well, this employee was previously on code V, category V, so you would want to use that? And the answer is no, they can't update RTI with that. The only thing that they will do is if category V has been used for more than 12 months, then the employer will be advised and will be told to stop. So that's the extra information that we know about veterans. The second one that we have is the NIC relief for free parts. So the first thing we need to understand is what a free part is. So free parts are special kinds of parts where normal tax and customs rules don't apply. It can be airports, it can be seaports, it might even be river ports if they are used as a hub. So near where I live, there's a town on the river, and it's quite inland because the river goes quite far inland. But I would expect that Goole would be able to be considered as a free port. So there's a little bit of thinking outside the box there. They're similar to free zones or enterprise zones, so they're designated areas subject to a broad array of special regulatory requirements, tax breaks, government support and whatever, because the government is trying to regenerate the import-export business, given that we've now left Brexit and we're trying to get more trade agreements. So what they're wanting to do is to encourage businesses to locate themselves in these free ports and stimulate economic activity in those areas. And they're doing that by giving, again, a zero rate of employer national insurance to all businesses that are based in a free port. So there will be, from the 6th of April, so this one isn't in now, it starts next April, there'll be a zero rate of employer national insurance contributions on employee earnings over that secondary threshold, up to a newly created free port upper secondary threshold, a FUST, which sounds great with a Yorkshire accent, and that one's different. That one does not mirror the normal upper secondary threshold, apprenticeship upper secondary threshold, or the veterans upper secondary threshold. They're all the same. This one's different. This one is £25,000. We've got 4 new NI category letters. On the screen, you've got an F, an I, an S, and an L. And to be eligible for that relief, the employer must have a physical premises within that free port tax site. I can see that they're thinking that people will just say that they're there even when they're not. And the employee must be a new hire after April 22 and can't have worked for the employer in the previous 2 years. So again, they're trying to make sure that they put in place all the, that block up all the loopholes before people exploit them. The NIC relief for the FUST is for 3 years, so that it ends 36 months after that employee started work. And on top of that, employees are only eligible if they spend at least 60% of their working time within the free port tax site. So the Health and Social Care Levy was announced to a big fanfare a couple of months ago, and again, this is something that has been announced but not with enough time for the government and the software developers to build that infrastructure into the software on both sides. So it needs to go into HMRC software as well as to payrolls. So we've got another interim arrangement, a bit like we did for the veterans. So the interim arrangement, before we can have the health and social care levy proper, is that there will be an increase, a temporary increase, we are assured, to national insurance across the board and every insurance rate will increase by 1.25%. Now, I say that with a bit of a caveat because we were told every NI category will increase by 1.25%, I did wonder whether that meant that those people who were over the state pension age who currently don't pay anything, does that mean that they would then get an increase and they would be paying 1.25%? But that is not the case for this first year. So for the first year, the NI rates all increase by 1.25%. So that's all the employee rates, all the employer rates, whether above the UAL or below, doesn't matter. Everything increases by 1.25%, except for the employees of state pension age will still be not contributing. They will still be paying nothing. In April 23, that reverts back down again, and all the NIC rates go back to normal. And then that's when the health and social care levy kicks in. And then that will apply to every employee, and that includes those over of state pension age. Employment allowance, the usual ways that you would calculate it still apply. Existing NIC reliefs still apply, so the zero rates for employing apprentices or veterans or whatever, all those will still apply. But the levy contribution must be shown separately on the payslip. So when the levy itself comes into force in April 2023, the payslip must have a separate entry for a health and social care levy contribution. And the government would like that also to happen even when it's just been an increase to national insurance. So essentially they want you to start putting a new message on your payslips from next April, whether it's because there's an increase to national insurance or whether it's the specific levy. So the actual message that they have asked payroll software providers to include on their payslips is 1.25% uplift in NIC's funds, NHS health and social care. Now this is a request. They're asking you to include this message. From April 2023, you have to include the message, but for this year, they're asking, please, will you include it? So you need to just talk to your payroll provider, find out whether they are including this message on the payslips, whether you want them to provide it on the payslips. And if you want to include this message, then maybe there's a discussion needed to be had with HR and directors as to whether you're going to go down that route or not. So let's now look at the rates and thresholds. So for the important rates and thresholds that affect us most for payroll, there will be no changes for the next tax year. So the personal allowance is the same. The personal allowance income limit is the same. There are increases, however, to the married couples allowance and the marriage allowance, because remember they are different, and to the blind person's allowance. So they've gone up in line with inflation, and the main two, personal allowance and the income limit, they are frozen, which we already knew because Rishi Sunak told us that. The NIC limits and thresholds. So we have had an increase to these. So the LEL rises from £120 to £123, and that is going up from 6240 to 6396 a year. The primary and secondary thresholds. The primary threshold is going up from £184 to £190, and the secondary threshold is going up from £170 to £175. So if we look at the annual limits, primary is going up from 9568 to 9880. and the secondary is going up from 8,840 to 9,100. As you know, you will get a copy of these slides. They'll be available on the MBKB website. So if you want to get back to these so that you know what the rates and thresholds are going up to, then you can get it from there. Alternatively, into the new year, I'll be creating a new payroll fact card, which will have all the rates and limits on, and you can just download a straightforward sheet. Continuing with national insurance, we can see that the UEL isn't changing for next year. The veterans upper secondary threshold sits in alongside the apprentice and the conventional upper secondary threshold, and again they're not changed, but the Freeport upper secondary threshold, we've now got the values for that. National minimum wage rates. We know that this year there was a change because national living wage, the age at which you can start, you're eligible for it, dropped from 25 to 23. But for next year, everything stays the same. So we now know what the rates will be, and you will need to start applying these new rates for the first pay reference period after the 1st of April 2022. The one thing that is key to notice here is that apprentices are now on a recognised, the same amount as the recognised age rate. So apprentices are now paid the same as the 16 to 17-year-olds. So apprentices, that was a big jump. They got 11% increase this year to bring them up to the same rate as 16 and 17-year-olds. And I think that we're, over the next few years, we're going to see these parameters change quite a lot, so that the aim is to increase the minimum amount of pay that workers get. Now, the national minimum wage rates are not to be confused with the real living wage. When the national living wage was introduced a few years ago, George Osborne, the Chancellor at the time, did create a bit of confusion because he created this new rate called the national living wage, but there was already something in place called the real living wage. So now we've got this confusion because you hear living wage, well, is it the national living wage or the real living wage, and what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the national living wage and the national minimum wage, they're mandatory, that legally you have to pay at least the national minimum or the national living wage. The real living wage rates that we've got on screen now, these are voluntary. These are set by the Living Wage Foundation, who does research and works out how much somebody would need to live on. And you will see it's a flat rate. There's one rate for London, there's one rate for the rest of the UK. It's not determined by, well, someone who's 18 does not need the same amount as someone who's 23. What they're saying is, if you are working, how much do you need to earn to be able to pay all your bills, essentially? Employers who want to pay the real living wage sign up to be a real living wage employer. So it is a contract and they are committed. They have to do, if they've signed it, then it's something that they have to do. The real living wage was announced last week, and employers then have up to 6 months in which to start applying these rates if they are a real living wage employer. Student loans. This is interesting because we've been given 2 rates for next year, but the other 2 haven't yet been announced. So you can see that for Plan 1, we've got an increase from 19,895 from next April, it's going up to 20,195. And the Plan 4 rate in Scotland, even though it's only just come in this year, it came in at 25,000 this year, it's going up to 25,375. What we don't know is what's happening to Plan 2 and the postgraduate loan, which suggests to me they may well be staying the same. But we can't say for definite until we get a commitment, either there's not going to be any change this coming year, or no, we were just a bit tardy, but here they are, here are the new rates. So keep your eyes out on that one. But otherwise, here's what we do know for next April. And the other, I said at the beginning of this session that there are a couple of things that we don't know. This is one, the Plan 2 and postgrad student loans we don't know. And the other thing we don't know are the statutory payment rates. But they are always issued towards the end of November, beginning of December. So we should know those within the next 2-3 weeks probably. For those of you who have company cars and vans, we know that the multiplier, I can't say that on Friday morning, the multiplier for car fuel benefit charge is going up from 24,600 to 25,300. The van benefit charge is also going up by £100, and the van fuel benefit charge is going up from 669 to 688. So what are we still living with for the time being? So I told you in the last session that the SSP rebate scheme for COVID-related illnesses, that was going to end on the 30th of September, which it did end. But the other element that was introduced for COVID affecting SSP was that for people who are off sick with a COVID related absence, the suspension of waiting days, i.e. the days that you do not pay for, that is still suspended. So in practice, what it means is that if somebody is off with a COVID related absence, and is off for 4 days or more. So it still has to be, the 3 waiting days and then the absence. So it still has to be an absence of at least 4 days. But if that bit is fulfilled, then you pay it from day one. So you will then pay for those waiting days. Obviously under a conventional absence, you've got the waiting days and then you start paying from day 4. With the COVID related SSP, you do the waiting, and then on day 4, if they're still off, you then would pay right from the beginning. That still applies now. And we still are waiting for confirmation as to how long this is going to go on for. We do know that if the government says nothing about it at all, then this suspension of waiting days will end on the 24th of March 2022. The reason we know that is because that was part of the legislation that was introduced through the Coronavirus Act in 2020. And the Coronavirus Act 2020 was given a 2-year lifespan. So all the legislation that was introduced as part of that CVA 2020 is due to end on the 24th of March 2022. And so that's when this will end. What we don't know is whether the government is then going to start introducing more legislation that will keep it going. I guess it depends on how long that pandemic keeps going. So at the moment, it's a sit and wait, but for the time being, for the paying from day one, it just carry on doing what you're doing. Virtual right to work checks. So this is just a reminder that you do still have to conduct right to work checks. Now in payroll, you're not the ones that do it, but you make sure that HR does it. So the right to work checks, simplifications were brought in due to COVID, which said that employers can conduct them by video rather than face to face. And that has been so successful that the government is now wanting to implement this kind of process moving forward, as a permanent arrangement. So what will happen at the moment is that a worker will you will ask a worker to submit a scanned or copied version of their documents, and they must send them to you via email or via WhatsApp or whatever, so that you've got a copy of their documents. And then once you've got that copy, you set up a video between you and the worker, whether it's on Teams or Zoom or whatever, and you would ask them to hold up the original document, and then you would compare it against the version that's been sent through to you ahead of time. And that can be evidence of a right to work check. If they don't have the documents, then you would still have to go through the usual channels, but if they do, then this is a quicker way of doing it. But just remember that passports or ID cards from the European Union or the EEA are not proof of right to work. All they do is prove someone's identity. They do not give anyone now the right to work here in the UK. Cycle to work easement, just to remind you, this is still ongoing, but if you have had anybody who has joined a cycle to work scheme after December the 20th, so from 21st of December last year onwards, then if they are not using that cycle to commute, then there is a tax charge for it. The reason is cycle to work schemes are in place with a condition that those cycles are provided on the basis that someone uses it mainly for commuting purposes. And of course, with more and more people working from home, they're now struggling to fulfill that criteria, because they're not doing so much commuting. They might not be doing any commuting. So the bikes might be getting used on a Sunday morning through the woods, but they're not getting used on the bypass on the way to work. So for people who had a bike before December 2020, then that criteria is dropped for now and won't kick in again until the new tax year, so from next April. But for anybody who got one after last December, i.e. by then we're already in the pandemic, and they knew that the chances are that they might not be working in the office, but they got a cycle to work bike anyway, then they've gone into it with their eyes wide open, which is why the tax charge will apply if they're not using it mainly to commute to work. The tax relief for home working, again, just a reminder, either your employer can pay you an allowance of £6 a week, in which case you don't need to worry about it. But if the employer doesn't pay that allowance, then everybody who is working from home, doesn't have to be every day of the week, doesn't even have to be every week, but if they are working from home or have worked from home during this tax year, then they can apply online to HMRC to get the £6 a week tax relief. It's much easier than trying to do extra costs, trying to work out what proportion of your electricity bill is an increase due to you working from home, rather than is an increase because fuel across the world has gone up. That is going to be so complicated. It's just easier to claim the flat £6 a week tax relief. Now, one that I know causes confusion, so I'll just stress it again. We mentioned it last time, but I'm just going to stress again if anybody wasn't on the session last time. Because excuse me, because so many of us are working from home, we need equipment to help us do that. So there has been an easement introduced about the tax charges that may or may not apply on the equipment that is being provided. And how that equipment has been provided or paid for is what is going to determine whether there's a tax charge. So if an employee purchases equipment for working at home and then the employer reimburses it. So I did that for my husband last week. He needed a lead to connect the new laptop that he'd been given because he got an upgrade. He needed a new lead to connect it to the monitor. So went on Amazon, ordered one, $9.99, and then my husband then claimed that cost back from his employer. There are no tax implications for doing that. If the employer provides equipment to the employee, so my husband's got a laptop from his employer, my husband will then be returning that laptop to his employer, either when his employment finishes or when he goes back to work and starts to use a desktop, either way. So there will be no tax implications there because essentially the employer is lending it to my husband, and so there's no change of ownership. However, there is a taxable benefit if the employer provides the equipment to the employee and then it is not returned. So, classic example, the office chair. My husband went to the office, got his office chair in the back of the car and brought it home. Bane of my life, it's in the corner of our living room the whole time. It's got to move on Christmas Day. I'm not having Christmas Day with his office chair in the corner. Anyway, as long as my husband takes the chair back to the office when he eventually returns to work, there is no taxable benefit. But if my husband's employer says, it's too much hassle bringing it back, just keep it, all of a sudden he's going to incur a tax charge. So if the employer has provided equipment that then they say, don't bother, just keep it, there is a change of ownership. All of a sudden now the employee owns that piece of equipment, and so then it would become a chargeable benefit. So just be clear about that, because depending on what happens over Christmas, we may or well start moving back to the office. So then you need to start thinking about this equipment and being aware of what has been provided on what basis and whether or not a tax charge is going to apply. A reminder of the off-payroll working penalties for the first 12 months. So you would have had to have been living on Mars not to know that the off-payroll working rules changed this year, and so they now apply to the private sector. Penalties will apply, but HMRC has said, right, we're going to take a light touch because we know it's going to take people some time to get used to this. So as long as employers try and go through the rules, have the conversation with the contractor, try and assess the employment status of that contractor, make that determination and apply the rules depending on what kind of status has been determined. If it turns out that you've gone through all that but actually you've made the wrong decision, HMRC will not apply penalties. The time when they will apply a penalty is if someone just doesn't go through the rules, if they don't even try. So essentially, if you try and follow the rules and get it wrong, no penalty. If you don't try and follow the rules, then you will incur a penalty. Advisory fuel rates have changed or will change from next week. The advisory fuel rates are reviewed every quarter. They come out 1st of December, 1st of March, 1st of December, 1st of March, 1st of June, 1st of September. I have been doing this job a long time. And this is the first time ever that I have seen it where every single rate has increased. And it reflects the fact of rocketing fuel prices across the world. So whereas most of the time, you probably don't really take that much difference about the advisory, take very much notice of the advisory fuel rates. This time, I think you need to, if you do have people who, you know, and going out and about a lot, and the advisory fuel rates is something that you pay. Now we do have significant changes. Every single rate has increased. Fully electric cars are still 5p a mile. That hasn't changed. That's the only one that hasn't, unsurprisingly. So looking ahead now. So easier access to apprenticeship funding. Large employers who've got a big levy pot and no hope of spending it have almost, since the introduction of the apprentice levy, it took a little bit of time, but quite early on, a process was introduced so that big employers can transfer some of their levy pot to other employers. This has been put on a more formal basis now, and on gov.uk there is now a pledge page, and employers with a big levy pot can pledge to fund an apprenticeship for somebody else. Now, what they can do is specify what type of apprenticeship or what kind of sector or what geographical area. They can say who it is that they would like to support. Smaller employers can go and look at this web page. It always feels to me a little bit like the pin board in the supermarket where people are buying and selling. So in effect, it's a bit like that. Each employer, the large one and the small one, must have an apprenticeship service account to be able to access these pages, but the pledge page is visible in the apprenticeship services account, and small employers can go in and have a look and see if there's anything available that would suit them, whether it's geographical, whether it's sector, whether it's the apprenticeship itself that someone is prepared to fund. It's not just a case of someone saying, oh, well, you know, I'm going to pledge £5,000. They have to commit to paying for the whole of the apprenticeship for its duration. But what they can't do is say that I'll pay for the employment costs, the wages, the pension, the everything else. That's not what the money's for. It's specifically to pay for that apprenticeship training. But guidance for both sides is now available, because before it was only there to tell employers how to advertise that they were going to pledge. There was no guidance for the small employers to say how to get access to it, but that's all there now. It's on gov.uk and it's quite easy to find. So what else? Solving the pensions tax relief anomaly has been something that has been a hobby horse of mine for quite a few years. The government has now finally agreed to implement a solution to the issue. For those of you who don't quite know about this issue, apprentices learn about the two different types of tax relief that is available to pension schemes. So you will either have a net pay arrangement where the amount of the pension is taken off first, and then what's left is what is taxed. Or a net pay arrangement where the pension contribution is included in that gross sum, and it's taxed accordingly, and then the tax relief is provided by the government later and it goes directly into the pension scheme itself. Now, these two processes only work if a worker actually pays tax in the first place. So if they are earning above the threshold so that they are actually taxed, because otherwise on a net pay arrangement, it matters not the point at which the pension contribution is taken off if they're never going to pay tax either before it's taken off or after it's taken off, meaning they aren't getting that tax relief. And so it's always been a huge problem with this system that the low paid are the ones that aren't getting the tax relief, i.e. the ones that need it most are the ones that don't qualify for it. And I've been in meetings with Treasury officials, ministers, saying, you need to give these people tax relief. And the answer has been, you can't get relief if you're not actually paying tax. Well, you have the information because you are topping up the pension of the pension scheme from those who are on a relief at source scheme. You know how much that has been deducted, then you put the balance back into their pension scheme. So why can't you do the same for the net pay arrangements? And they have finally agreed that yes, that is what they will do. They won't implement it until the 2024-25 tax year, so we've still got a way to go, but at least at that point they will start with a system so that at the end of the 2024-25 tax year they will look to see for net pay arrangement pensions how much has been paid in, whether they've had benefit of tax relief, and if not, then the government will top it up, which is a good thing. It's just a shame that we've got to wait so long. So remember, if you are asked that question at your endpoint assessment about tax relief, you now know how it works. We've also got on the horizon an anti-money laundering levy. So the new levy, it's not going to be like the apprenticeship levy, I don't think. So in itself, I don't think it's going to affect payroll because I doubt that it's going to be taxed in that way. But it will still apply to any of the businesses that are subjected to supervision for money laundering purposes. So if you are registered with a supervisory authority, that applies to accountancy businesses, payroll bureaus, perhaps any kind of organisation like that. I think estate agents are part of it. So it's not just the automatic organisations that you think of. You wouldn't necessarily think an estate agent might need to be registered for money laundering purposes. But organisations who are registered with a supervisory body for anti-money laundering purposes will be subjected to a levy. It comes into effect in 22-23 financial year, i.e. starting next April, and the amount payable is determined on the size of the UK revenue. So essentially, how profitable a business is will determine how much levy they pay. The reason why I'm talking to you now about it is because it could well be that people in your business hear the words anti-money laundering levy and think, oh, well, must be the same as the apprenticeship levy, so payroll will be sorting it out. So you need to know that little bit of background just so that you can answer any questions and point people in that right direction. So as and when I get more information about it, I will let you know so that you can answer any other questions that come up in your business. In the last update that we delivered, I talked about the changes that were being made to the universal credit system so that DWP's computer system is going to identify universal credit claimants who've had a second monthly salary payment in 1 month. So that's probably going to happen again at Christmas. People are paid, normally paid, say, on the 31st of the month, so normally they'll be paid on the 31st of December, but actually they're going to get paid on the 21st of December because it's Christmas and so the boss is paying early. DWP may well look at that and think, oh, they've had a pay rise, so we'll stop the universal credits from next month, when in actual fact it's just that they're not going to get any more money than they would have. It's just that they've got one bit a little bit earlier. DWP system will now recognise that, flag it up. A DWP advisor will look at it and determine whether to actually move the payment back theoretically so that the universal credit benefits are unaffected. But there is another situation very similar to that that's caused huge problems, especially for local authorities, because local authorities very commonly pay every 4 weeks. So this situation will arise 2 or 3 times a year where someone will get 2 payments in a calendar month because they are paid every 4 weeks instead of every calendar month. So they'll get paid at the beginning and the end of the calendar month, but 4 weeks apart. And that has caused these same problems with the universal credit payments, where the DWP system thinks someone's had a pay rise and stops the benefits. On the last session that I did, somebody asked a question to say, will the 4 weekly payments be dealt with in the same way as where somebody's paid early? And I couldn't answer at that point because it was still subject to a court case. It was still going through an appeal tribunal. We have now had the outcome of that appeal, and the answer is no. Those who are paid 4 weekly will nothing changes, so they will still be subjected to that issue where it looks sometimes like they've had a pay rise, so the benefits may stop. The court has said that DWP does not need to change its systems to accommodate a 4 weekly pay frequency. So the claimants in the case are still deciding whether to appeal again, but it leaves local authorities with a big conundrum. Do they change the pay frequencies to calendar months to solve this problem for their employees, or do they accept that the 4 weekly pay frequency is going to continue to present big problems for their employees who are claiming universal credits? And that's a conundrum that really you just need to get your heads around. Communicating with governments. The government has issued or announced recently 2 different ways that you can communicate with government. The first, it does make me chuckle because it's an online tool so that you can find out when you can expect to receive a reply from HMRC. Now, quite honestly, would most people just rather have the reply from HMRC rather than a new tool that tells them that it's going to be another 3 weeks before they get an answer, or probably 30 weeks before they get an answer? Anyway, there's an online tool. It is in place now. So if you just put into Google, when can I get a reply from HMRC, you would be taken to that tool, asks you a series of questions about your query, and then it gives you the answer of, forget it, mate, you're not getting one, which is a cynical answer from someone who actually used to work for HMRC. But I do think that really what needs to happen is that they focus their energies on getting the replies out, rather than saying, well, it's all right, because we've told them it's going to be months before they get an answer. The next new way of communicating is a gov.uk app, and hopefully what this app will do, it's still in the development stage, it's not here yet, we've not got an expected delivery date, but there are at the moment 191 different ways that you can set up accounts on gov.uk. So whether it's for your driving licence or your passport or NHS, whatever it is, there's 191 different ways. And what they're wanting is to bring this together so that you only need to put your details in once, because your name hasn't changed, your date of birth hasn't changed, your national insurance number hasn't changed, and that then will go across the whole of the gov.uk interface so that you don't have to keep inputting all that information time after time after time. I'll keep you updated on that process as well, but for the time being, that's still in development, so we wait to see how that is going to pan out. And that brings us to the end of the session so far. So now I would like to ask, do we have any questions? We've not had any verbally, so is there anybody with any questions that you want to put in the chat box or that you'd like to speak out loud now? Okay, well, it doesn't look like we've got any questions. So I would like to thank you all very much for spending this Friday morning with me. And the webinar will be available on the MBKB website. If you want to find it, you just scroll down to go onto the homepage, click on for the for information, and then go to the payroll resources page. I've had a none from me, thank you for the update, so you are very, very welcome. If anybody does have any questions, just email in helen@mbkbgroup.com, and otherwise I will wish you a very happy rainy Friday, and hope that you all have a very good weekend. So take care, and I will speak to you next time. And thank you. Yes, I will have a lovely weekend too. Thank you.